sei qui con me. Questa stanza non ha più pareti, ma alberi.
I'm going to do something quite unusual for me. I'm going to read my presentation. And I'm doing this for two reasons. One, it might help with the translation. And second, these thoughts originally started off as a blog post, which just got bigger as I got more ideas. And I've chosen the French saying, "Le plus ça change, la même chose." The more things change, the more they stay the same. For two reasons. First, I am desperately missing being part of the European Union. But they can't stop me from seeing my identity as European first and British last. Thank you. So can I just say that whoever is Prime Minister today, thanks you for that round of applause. It's got to be my turn soon. But the second thing is that when I think back on my life as an educator, it does feel that the more things change, the more they do indeed stay the same. And I think that the pace of change in education can be incredibly slow. So I want to start by asking your forgiveness for any impression I give of pouring cold water on the genuinely exciting thoughts and ideas you've already heard this morning and will continue to hear for the next day or so. I've spent 2 decades in education working on innovation. And I believe that if you gather 100 innovators together in a room, there will probably be less than a handful that have deeply considered how to make their ideas stick and how to overcome resistance to change. And of all disciplines, education often feels the most resistant to change. I also hope that you'll forgive the fact that I'm building this provocation around some very personal experiences. We're all living through some extraordinary times, and education cannot, as Alessandra said at the start, be immune to those experiences. So this is going to feel a bit more like a short story than an academic paper. On February the 24th, Vladimir Putin's army invaded Ukraine. And it was a decisive moment, not just for the whole world, but on a deeply personal level. My wife and I watched the horror of those early attacks on Kyiv, Bucha, and Donetsk, and told ourselves that for once we wouldn't look away and would find a way to help. Over the next few days, events escalated alongside our own personal commitment. I happened to be appearing at a conference in London, the BET Education Show, and I was fielding desperate calls from refugees. And I remember attending a session on designing refugee-based education programs while my phone was constantly ringing with messages from desperate people trying to escape from Mariupol. Suddenly, writing ideas on Post-it notes about education seemed a bit pointless. So I made my excuses, and in tears of frustration, I called my wife to see how we could help. And by that evening, we'd been visited by a Ukrainian lawyer who was desperate to get her family out of Kyiv. And we'd contacted a humanitarian group, which was going to Poland, trying to match families with hosts in the region. During that frantic first week, we were able to match about 20 hosts with families in the Harrogate area, which is where I live in God's own county of North Yorkshire. And at the time, frustrated UK sponsors on Facebook couldn't understand why I was being inundated with requests and they weren't. Now, British exceptionalism, and we are really good at exceptionalism, but that meant that unlike other functioning democracies in the EU, the UK government, and it's hard to use that word when you're talking about the UK right now, but the UK government was denying entry to refugees who didn't have sponsorship. But the refugees knew nothing about the government scheme, which in any case made no attempt to match them up with hosts. Hosts had to find their own families before they could be offered shelter. But I knew Avi, and all the Ukrainians knew Avi, or at least they knew his website, Ukraine Take Shelter. And I'm going to come back to Avi later because he's central to my argument. So, within a few days, our first family arrived and our lives changed forever. That family stayed for 2 months and now has rented accommodation nearby. And we're currently hosting a 19-year-old art student who's trying to start a new life in a strange country. The next significant date, and this is even more personal, is June 17th, when I was rushed into hospital in the worst pain I can ever remember. I had a strangulated gut brought on by a parastomal hernia. Good luck with that one. The emergency surgery was followed by a period in intensive care and a slow recovery. And this gave both me and my wife plenty of time to reconsider our lives. Now, I'm nearly 70. I know I don't look it, but I'm nearly 70, and I probably should have retired years ago. I've spent a lifetime working on innovation projects in education. Now, I use the word innovation in air quotes because, as we all know, there's nothing really new in education. It's just the repackaging of existing parts. But I've worked with government-funded organizations in several countries trying to innovate at scale. And I've also worked in the classroom. And for the past 20 years, I've trained teachers in pedagogical approaches. So I've kind of worked both top down and bottom up. And some of the initiatives that I've led were predicted to have a shelf life of about 2 to 3 years in the UK. And yet they're still going 20 years later and they're spread all around the world. So that's all good. But other projects that I led were prematurely abandoned by nervous foundations and government agencies, sadly proving Thomas Edison's famous maxim that many of life's failures are people who did not realize how close they were to success when they gave up. And a former Secretary of State for Education summed up the resistance I mentioned earlier after hearing a progress report from myself. And she said, "So why are you using these kids as guinea pigs?" You see, that's the problem with experiments in education. You can't try them out on rablats first. So if I'm being brutally honest, I'd have to ask myself, as I frequently did during those long nights on the recovery ward, what has actually changed as a result of my work or the work of my colleagues? Now, I sense that most people here would be part of the same church. We could broadly class it as progressives. And now, if you are in the UK, being labelled a progressive is a deeply depressing experience. We've had the same government for 13 years, hopefully not much longer. The sense of frustration at the glacial pace of change has led me to increase the amount of school consultation and training that I did with my wife and other colleagues like Valerie Hannon, who you may know. And Valerie was very involved in the OECD project that we heard earlier. And it has been communities with this and schools that have greatly enjoyed this sense of learning that a longer relationship has been. And when I talk about top down and bottom up, it's the bottom up which makes me feel like I'm doing something useful. My great friend and true education innovator, Larry Rosenstock, has always said that you can't simply scale up a model, be it Kunskapsskolan or big picture, as every school has to be different because every community is different. However much we intuitively know that, there are two challenges that I've got to Larry's wisdom. First, as much as these schools are wonderful, inspiring examples of what can be possible, they have to be measured against some ill-thought-through, headline-grabbing idea of an education minister, and we've had 6 in the UK in the past 12 months. 6. Some education minister desperate to make a name for themselves. And so these new ideas are often just the repackaging of old ideas, but they change the structure, turn everything upside down. without having any noticeable impact upon a child's learning. So, however much we admire the beautiful exceptions, as I like to call them, schools like New Roads in California, the high-tech high schools, they're just that. They're the beautiful exceptions. And I've no idea how we convince the ministers and their advisors of the urgent need for many more of them. But my second challenge to that received wisdom is a little bit more personal. The clock is ticking for all of us. And I, for one, don't want to go to my grave wondering, is that it? Was that all there is? I mean, imagine for a minute that we were a gathering of vaccine researchers, geneticists, or tech entrepreneurs reviewing the incredible advancements of the past 50 years. Would we be amazed at the progress made? Or would we be arguing for some ancient bloodletting technique as a cure for bubonic plague? Because many education initiatives are the equivalent of turning the clock back instead of asking, what's next? Now, I don't want to depress us all, so let me share what gives me hope and what's given me hope, particularly during the past 5 to 10 years. A growing number of those tech entrepreneurs that I mentioned have moved into the education space, and they're determined to shake things up. People like Christopher Pomring, and you'll hear from Devon and Stephen Harris from Learn Life. Christopher's the CEO with a tech background, or Gwyn Ap Harry, who's the CEO at XP Schools in Doncaster in England. They're typical of this new breed, and they bring a startup mentality to education design, partly since they now have kids of their own, and they bring an urgency and an impatience for change, and they're not risk averse. And I've been lucky enough to work with both Christopher and Gwyn, and we need lots more like them. And the second cause for hope is the incredible ingenuity and social enterprise shown by young people like Amna, who we just saw earlier, Marigold, who you'll hear from later, and many others I've met around the world. And this is where I want to return to Avi. Avi Schiffman is his name. And I first came across Avi, who was then just 17 and living in Seattle when I was researching this book. Because if you remember, at the start of COVID, the world was trying to find a way to track the spread of the pandemic. And the UK, with his glorious leader then, Boris Johnson, claimed it had a world-beating app in COVID tracking. It never actually saw the light of day because it wouldn't run on iPhones or Android phones. There was only hundreds of millions of pounds wasted. But Avi created a COVID tracking website over 3 days and 3 nights at the age of 17. So for this achievement, he won the Webby Person of the Year. For those of you not familiar, it's like the web version of the Oscars. And this last part I'm calling, are we there yet? Any of you who've got kids and take them on car journeys know that expression. Because Avi is an example, to me at least, about how I would know that education truly was being transformed. Because when I interviewed Avi, he was applying to various colleges in the USA, and he was very pessimistic about his chances of getting into any of them. And I said, why is that? And he said, because I've got a grade point average of 1.7. Those of you who know the American system know that it goes from 0 to 4. So 1.7 isn't particularly good. But I suggested that he shouldn't waste his time on a college that would have such a narrow view of his talents. But he was indeed rejected by a number of colleges before finally being accepted by Harvard. So it kind of worked out all right in the end. And the problem is, in many countries, we're failing to see, I believe, this new generation of ethically driven social activists because of curricula that's rigid, overblown, and more suited to a time when young people were expected to conform and be factory fodder. These young people, as we've seen with Amna, are incredibly well networked, and they're not waiting. Initiatives like Redes de Tutoria, which some of you may be familiar with in South America, show that each one, like Amna, can indeed teach one, And I would predict that within 10 years, there will be a high-level online learning platform which is entirely managed by young people with little need for professional educators. And in this regard, I'm proud to advise a thing called the Mastery Transcript Consortium, which began life in the USA, but is now being adopted in schools all around the world. And it's trying to broaden the recognition of skills, attitudes, values, and knowledge that employers have been asking for decades. And I've championed the Mastery Transcript in both the UK and in Australia for years, but it's been surprisingly hard work, not least because of parental and political suspicions of anything that challenges the dominance of standardized national testing. So for me, that's where we need to start the revolution. So in closing, here are some questions that a number of us have been asking for some time, seen through Avi's eyes. I know that real systemic change is starting to happen when these questions are even being considered by policymakers and education ministers everywhere. First, why can't Avi's extracurricular achievements be more widely acknowledged and accredited by colleges and universities? I know of the Rahal initiative in Dubai, which seeks to do that, but again, we're talking about beautiful exceptions here. The second one, Avi described himself to me as a terrible student, but it was on the basis of a curriculum that emphasized his weaknesses and not his strengths. When are we going to have a curriculum that engages with students' strengths? How can we fix it? I thought we were supposed to have personalized learning already. Third, how do progressive educators mobilize parental voice and vision to demand an education worth having, as the Australians describe it? Because I think that if we're to be honest, we failed to communicate effectively with parents so far. And then finally, in Avi Schiffman's first year at Harvard, he created the Ukraine Take Shelter website that has found homes for tens of thousands of desperate refugees, including the 2 families that we've been able to house. And I would just say this, imagine if all schools and colleges could do that. They built the learning programs around these big global social problems, or just spent time improving their communities. Isn't that more significant than being able to recognize obscure grammatical constructions? I would argue it is. Now, I am by nature an optimist, because young people will do that to you, as you all know. Most educators start out as optimists, but over time, it's the systemic and cultural blockages to change that in turn change that can-do attitude into a passive, compliant deliverer of content. Not lighting fires, just trying not to extinguish the ones that they already brought. And I would say that if we want to see change, real change, sustainable change happen, we have to think differently about how we prepare our communities for change. We have to think about how we anticipate the resistance to that change and how we're going to work around those blockages. And you know, we don't have to look very far for inspiration. Just up the road, in fact, the Reggio Emilia experiment is still going strong around the world. And I know it's maybe not as strong where it first began, but it is spread around the world. It's an inspiring story of success. And the fact that it still seems radical now speaks to the conservatism of our current climate. And I think we can learn from Reggio in the success in the way that it insisted that parents and children co-constructed the pedagogy. We can aspire to see schools as the social glue that binds communities together. In a post-COVID world, I believe there's nothing more important than that. And it's something that the people in Reggio Emilia enjoyed. And finally, we can take inspiration from the fact that the first Reggio schools, and I only found about this recently, but those first schools were funded from the sale of tanks and military equipment after the end of the Second World War. When this current war is over, Let's hope that we, as a global network of educators, can match the ambitions first seen in that town, 50 kilometers from here. Grazie mille.
Quando sei qui con me, questa stanza non ha più